Wasn't that lady who did the prayer really gorgeous? Oh, man. Need to get her number. Hey, who went to Big Camp? Put your hands up. Yep. Great. I only saw half of those with their hands up. I was on reception, and I got caught out a few times doing my job with my feet up on the table, sitting on a seat. And people were wondering, do these pastors really work? They do. My job was a very different one than the other pastors, in that most of the work I had to do was before camp. I had to give you good spots. We were an allocation, and we had to make sure you're in a place that was flat and nice. So if there's anyone who wants to complain, don't talk to me. Talk to Audrey. She's the boss. And I know that when we went to camp, it was rainy and it was really windy and crazy, but I hope that you got a blessing for those who went, because we haven't had Big Camp in Victoria for a long time. I think it's been 4 years. This is the 5th year coming into Big Camp, and I think a lot of people just enjoyed coming together and worshiping, and I surely enjoyed it too. But we're back, and we're back to start off a new chapter in Wantirna's annual cycle. And we are really going to be pushing this idea of small groups. In fact, we're starting a new series that is talking about small groups. And let me just make sure that everything is all in order. Great. The series is entitled Acts the Gathering. And today, I'll be sharing you almost a brief overview of the importance of groups. But before we start, of course, I would love to be able to bow heads and again invite the Holy Spirit as we start today's message. Please bow your heads. Father in heaven, Lord, we want to thank you so much for everything that you do for us. We want to thank you for just the ability to come to church and to worship you in the way that we do. And so I just want to pray that as I speak, again, as I always pray, that it is not me speaking, but it's you speaking through me. May we be able to leave with a blessing. And we also pray for your Holy Spirit's presence here in the empty spaces of the pews. May your angels be sitting and gathering and collecting and being with us as we worship together, is our prayer in your name. Amen. The year was 170 AD, or 170 AD. And a man called Marcus Aurelius was going to wage war on a few people on the border of his empire. Now, if you know who Marcus Aurelius is, he was the Roman emperor in the AD version of the Roman Empire. And if you know the story, you know that there are the northern frontier that they waged war against. The Germanic tribes and certain other people coming. You probably heard of barbarians. These types of people were coming and encroaching on the Roman Empire's northern front. And so Marcus Aurelius waged war, and he made a peace agreement with a certain people called the Quadi. Now, the Quadi were very interesting because even though the peace agreement was brokered, they thought that they could still defeat the Roman Empire, which is a really big claim back then because they were the biggest empire in the world, albeit crumbling at the time. And they started to encroach on the border and actually take over territory of the Roman Empire slowly but surely during this time of peace. And so Marcus Aurelius heard, and he said, this is not going to happen in my Rome, and I'm going to send my finest men. And if you know anything about the Roman Empire, you'll know and you'll understand when I say he sent the 12th Legion. The 12th Legion were infamous. They were the special ops of the Roman Empire. These were the ones that the Romans would go and look to if they wanted to really have something done quick, fast, and effective. Now, if you have a look on the screen, maybe it's a bit hard to see, but on the shields and on the regalia and on the signs, you'll notice that there are lightning bolts. In fact, their name in Latin was Legio Fulminata, which means armed with lightning. The lightning bolts would come out of the shields and of the signs. And the good thing about legions, we don't really know this and understand this in our modern day and age, but a legion actually had about 6,000 soldiers in the one legion. We're not talking about a few hundred people together in a small group. We're talking about a huge army. And you can see that if it was the 12th legion, the Roman army had quite a lot of legions to dispatch if needed. Now, this particular legion had the infantry, had the ranged, had the horseback. They had everything that you needed. They even had cooks and cleaners and maids. They walked as one and they moved together as one. You could dispatch them and they could wage war on a country on their own for years. The cool thing about the 12th Legion was that they were infamous because they started in 48 BC by Julius Caesar. Does anyone know who Julius Caesar is? He was an important guy for the Roman Empire. In fact, only a few years later, it was run by a guy called Mark Antony. You've heard of him? So we're talking about the celebrity legion. We're talking about the best of the best. And so this 12th Legion went and waged war against the Quadi, and they retreated. But the problem about this infantry, this legion, is they got a bit cocky because they started to move in very quickly, as their name suggests, like lightning. And they got to a valley where the Quadi all came up around the mountains and cut them off from the back, and they were surrounded. The 6,000 strong legion was losing the battle and had been stuck in a valley surrounded. Now, to add to the story, it had not rained for 4 weeks, so it was very dry. It was very opposite to what Big Camp was like. There was no rain at all. It was just dry and dusty, and they had no way of getting water. And so they only had a few days left, but they knew they would be toast if they couldn't do anything about it. It's interesting, the Quadi then started to get a bit cocky themselves. They saw that the legion was dying out, and so they just left a few scouts on the top of the mountainside just to remind the Roman army that they were still there, and the rest of them went home, thinking that they would just go and die. Now, I want to leave that scenario just for a second, and I want to bring you to the context of the Bible. Now, a lot of times we don't see the intersectionality of history and the Bible, but the interesting thing about the 12th Legion is that they're actually featured in the New Testament. In fact, you might even know that Paul was in prison when he was writing letters to churches. In fact, the second half of the New Testament are letters to churches that Paul was imprisoned as he was writing. And the Bible actually says a few characters that were mentioned, a guy called Julius, who was a centurion that Paul had a good connection with. When you look in the history books, you realize that the 12th Legion were actually the group of Roman soldiers who were charged to look after Jerusalem. They were the Roman soldiers who were there when Paul was imprisoned and when he was preaching. In fact, we know in the Bible that Paul had such an impact on some of the Roman soldiers that they turned and became Christians themselves. Well, here's the interesting thing. We move almost 100 years into the future, and most of the legion of the 12th are Christians. And you can see the seed that was planted by Paul the Apostle all the way back in jail as he wrote letters to the churches and evangelized to these Roman soldiers. So here we have 100 years later, and their Christian legion about to die. And so what do? They split up into small groups and they pray together for a few hours and ask God to save them. Can you imagine these burly, muscly military men who are meant to be the best of the Roman army, and they split up in small groups and they pray? To me, it sounds like a miracle in itself to be able to see such a picture. But you see this army split up, pray, and then go to sleep, not knowing what the next day will bring. Because the next day, it was do or die for them. They had to attack. They had no other option. As the Roman soldiers slept, they heard a trickle of rain, just slowly, come down on their tents. And then it got a little bit louder, just enough rain for the Roman soldiers to put their hands out and to drink and to have sustenance and to get energy. Little did they know that the water was actually a lot stronger on the mountainside though. It was storming, it was thundering. It was so crazy that the scouts on the mountainside for the Quadi either died or retreated. And so the next day, when the Roman soldiers woke up, they were refreshed, they were renewed, they went to attack and no one was there. And they ran all the way back to the Quadi base and defeated them. Now, this is what they call the rain miracle. And if you don't believe me, if you think that this is just an evangelistic kind of Pastor Dan making up something really cool to just use as an analogy for a sermon, yes, we do that sometimes as pastors, but let me show you something. If you go to Rome, you will actually see a column. It's called the column of Marcus Aurelius. And right there, I've zoomed in, they've got a picture of the rain miracle. Isn't that amazing, church? That you can see that in history, it was so important for Marcus Aurelius to put a miracle of God in the middle of such a pagan empire and to see the effects of Paul and his evangelizing. It was so important to Marcus Aurelius that the name of the 12th changed from Legio Fulminata to Legio Fulminatrix, which means the thundering legion. They moved from armed with lightning to the thundering legion. Now, you might ask yourself the question, what on earth has that got to do with small groups? Why would I start with such a weird and abstract story? Well, here's the thing. We now refer to our timeline when we talk to people as before COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID, right? Our timelines have kind of changed. When we talk about times, we think 2019 before, that was the time before the world changed, right? Then you have the 2 years in between, and now we're in the post-COVID era. And what did the post-COVID era bring? Well, it brought a disconnection of people. It brought us apart. And so now we're trying to be put back together in society as a church as well, and we're struggling because we were so apart from each other, and now we're trying to come back. I can even show you in the numbers. End of last year, before Yoshi left, we did an NCD survey on the church. Do you remember when I just killed you guys with surveys? It was like one Sabbath, and I gave you 3 surveys to do. By the way, we've got another one next week. I'll just put that in there. But we did the survey, and we found out that there are different characteristics of a healthy church, and our lowest characteristic was, surprise, surprise, small groups. Why? Because naturally we were apart from each other. And even though we're together, we're still struggling to be able to come together. And for some reason, post-COVID Christians are now starting to see, maybe I can do Christianity alone. Maybe I can just be at home, watch a sermon for Sabbath, and that's the box that's ticked. My journey with Christ for that week is complete. We've changed our mentality about what church really means. Do we really need to meet together? Why can't I just, even now, go online or even come to church for an hour, tick a box, go home, feel good about yourself that you've done your duty? This is scary because being a Christian is the hardest and most scariest and dangerous position on the earth. Did you know that? If you believe that there's a great controversy that's going on above us with angels and demons vying for our soul, vying for us to either come to their side or the other side, you might realize that if you are a Christian, you are on the front lines, and that's great. If you don't like conflict, maybe Christianity is not for you. And being a Christian, even Jesus tells us that we're going to have a lot of things that we have to deal with. He even says to the extreme that you might even have to die for his name's sake. So what do we do if we're not meeting together? We naturally go to Ephesians 6, which is the armor of God, to show what types of things we need to do to counter the devil. You know, this is the stuff that we need. We need the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth, the shoes of peace, the shield that is faith, right? And of course, the sword of the Spirit. These are the things that we can use to counter the devil. The thing that we don't realize, and I didn't even know this really until a few weeks ago, was that we stop when we finish reading the armor of God. But there are a few verses after in Ephesians 6 that give it a greater picture. Have a read with me, church. Ephesians 6 verses 18 to 19 says this: "Pray in the Spirit at all times and on every occasion. Stay alert and be persistent in your prayers for all believers everywhere. And pray for me too. Ask God to give me the right words so I can boldly explain God's mysterious plan that the good news is for Jews and Gentiles alike." Paul, in Ephesians 6, is telling us the armor of God that we need to deal with the devil. But if you keep reading, it says that it's all so that we can pray for each other as fellow believers together. Even Paul says, hey, while you're at it, can you pray for me too? The thing with fighting is that it looks really silly if you go to battle on your own. Has anyone read the book Don Quixote? Yeah? And there are parts where he looks really dumb. There's a part where he goes on his own to wage war against windmills, right? And it looks really dumb because it's supposed to look that way. But if you are a Christian and you think that you can do Christianity alone by yourself, you're almost looking like Don. Not our Don, but Don, right? This idea that you go and you wage war against each other, when you put the armor of God on, the Bible almost assumes that you should not be fighting alone. If you read that in the Jewish context, if you read that in the Roman context, you will completely understand that fighting alone never makes sense. An author called Paul Tripp, in his book Dangerous Calling, says this: "Autonomous Christianity never works because our spiritual life was designed by God to be a community project." Now, he could say group project, and we might all have PTSD from group projects from university. I get it. There are some of us who are introverts, who don't like to work together in teams, and that's okay. But it still doesn't mean that you can do Christianity alone. Moses needed Aaron. Barnabas, who was Barnabas with? Paul. What about David and Jonathan? Even the Son of God, Jesus, needed his three closest friends in his greatest time of need. And so, the same can be said about us and about church and about Christianity. And if there ever was a job description for what a church is meant to do, it's this one, and you've probably heard of it in Hebrews 10, verses 23 to 25. This is the job description. This is what we're meant to do as a church. It says this: "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching." The reason why we're meant to come together as a church is because we're meant to stir up good works. We're supposed to love each other, and we're supposed to exhort each other. Exhort is a weird word, but if you type it into Google, all it means is to strongly encourage and urge each other. In other words, to uplift, to push, to be accountable, to make sure that they don't fall off, to make sure that they're okay. And it says the expiry date is until the day approaches. In other words, we're meant to do that until Jesus comes again. Now, it seems as though when you go to different churches, different denominations, even different churches in the Adventist church, there's almost a sense that you can either go to a church that has a large group feel or a small group feel. Do you know what I mean when saying a church? You can go to a different church and they either put a lot of effort into the sermon and the music and the service, or they put a lot of effort in the small groups. You know, the really small things. They go to home church and invite people to lunch and all that kind of stuff. But the thing is, when leaders come together and choose what do they want for the church, it should not be one or the other. When you're asked to say what type of church you should have, it should not be the big or the small. It should be yes. It should be both. A healthy church needs balance between the large gatherings and the small gatherings. Now, we're going to be spending quite a few weeks on the small groups idea, because that's the thing that as churches we don't do well at, especially our Adventist church. But let me just say to you, I'm not asking and saying that Wantirna Church turns into a small group church. I'm saying that we as a church become a balanced and healthy church. And it's interesting because this is something in Scripture actually tells us this balance. This isn't me reading the leadership books written, in the last 5 years. This is 2,000 years ago, an example in the Bible that never changes. In Acts 5, verse 42, it says this, "And daily in the temple and in every house, they did not cease teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ." Now, I just want to see a show of hands. Who is willing to come to church every day? Oh, goodness. 2 people, great. Now, I'm not asking you to do it daily, but it is the structure, the biblical structure of a church is the temple and the home. When you look at Acts 2, it even goes further. In Acts 2, verses 46 to 47, it says, "So continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved." Notice again the balance. The temple and the house, the home. Large and small. And you'll notice a very small detail, that the Lord added to the church. In other words, the church wasn't just those who went to the temple. The church was also those in the home. And this is where I think COVID actually has helped us understand this, because if this building just collapsed next week, and I hope it doesn't, Lord, please keep this up. But if this building collapsed and there was only a tree outside in the backyard and we all went under that tree and we worshiped God, do you know what that would be called? A church service. Because a church doesn't have to be within the walls of a building with the sign on the front. The church is just a believer who comes together with another believer. And he said, if 2 or 3 gather in my name, I am there also. Guess what? That's a church. I think COVID helped us understand that a church doesn't necessarily have to be in the designated building with a sign on the front. Now, you guys know me well by now, that almost every sermon I'll find a way to incorporate Lord of the Rings, right? Because it's my favorite movie. But here's the thing. Lord of the Rings was written by J.R. Tolkien, who was a what? What was he? He was a Christian, right? And it's interesting to see that one of the best examples of a church is actually in the first book or movie called, does anyone know what the first movie is called? Thank you, Adrian. I'll give you something later. The Fellowship of the Ring, a fellow nerd like myself. The Fellowship of the Ring is basically this ragtag of group of people coming together for one cause. If you've ever seen the movie, you'll know that there's hobbits, there are humans, there are elves, there are dwarves. All of these people would not mingle with each other, and yet here they are together, albeit fighting, but they get along eventually. And why do they come together? Because they have one purpose, to make sure that the ring is destroyed. The church has exactly the same idea. We look around and we have different people from different countries, ethnicities, ages, beliefs. But the beauty of a church is to bring them together for one cause. And do you know what that cause is? What's the cause? Why do we come together as a church? Because of Christ. We all believe that the world can be a better place if Jesus is in the center of it. We all believe that Christ is coming back again. So we come together and we worship and we encourage and uplift. We come here for one cause only, and that is for God. God is what connects all of us. And when we come together and when a church can embrace this idea of a collective unity for one cause, something amazing happens. Trust. This is what takes the cake when it comes to coming together as a church. More than just sitting down, listening to a sermon, listening to great music for an hour and then going home. To get trust, to have the feeling that the person to the left and the right of you has your back, you need to spend time with them. Because the great thing about trust is it makes you feel safe. When you're in a community of believers who you feel like will not judge you, will not be able to just smash you down and make you even worse, that when you come together and you'll be uplifted and encouraged, something amazing happens. Trust forms, and you have the ability to take risks, to experiment, to push the boundaries, to do things together as a church. Can you imagine? And I know that it's not hard to imagine, but pretty much over the last maybe 60, 70 years, maybe even a century, we have been told that when you come to church, you need to put on a face and you need to be a certain person to enter the church. If you have problems and if you have worries during the week, leave them at home because they do not belong in the church. We want to see you with big smiles. We want to make sure that you're only going to bring joy to each other, and we don't want to hear all the burdens that you're going to bring into the church. Have you ever been to a church that acts like that? And I pray that it's not this one. Because a church like that does not have trust. But when you know that the person on your left and on your right has your back, that you spend time with them, you know that they're broken, you know that they're humans just like you, you have the ability to take risks and to go together and do new things and to become yourself in a community. There's nothing better than being able to come together to church and just be who you are. Me, Pastor Dan, come in. When I am in a church, even as a pastor, and I know that the church has my back, that means I can take risks and I can experiment and I will fail. But knowing that the church doesn't mind that, they know me and they understand me, that I want the best for the church, that is an amazing feeling. And it's the same for you guys coming here. Don't you want to feel like you're a part of a church that has a safe mentality, a safe space? If you've ever heard of a guy called Simon Sinek, he's got some great books, but he talks about this idea of the performance and trust matrix. Basically what he did is he went to speak to some Navy SEALs, which would be very scary to be able to talk to them and encourage and motivate them because they're the best of the best. They're basically the 12th Legion of the Navy. They're the special ops. Let me just have a drink. And on that graph, you may not be able to see, I'm not sure how easy it is to see from where you're sitting, but basically they would put recruits or potential recruits on a matrix to see if they're going to hire you and bring you into the Navy SEALs. And this is what they do. They categorize you as to high performance, low performance, medium performance, and trust. Low trust, medium trust, and high trust. And what they found was that the recruits that they decided to take into the Navy SEALs, you would think they would want to have the high performance. High performance means they're fit, they're competent, they're ready to fight, they're the best of the best. And you would think that they would choose high performance over high trust. But that was not the case. In fact, when they were looking at the recruits over the time period that they had the data for, they noticed that in the green, those were the types of people that they would hire the most. The best ones were, of course, those who were high performance and high trust. But notice, they would hire someone who had low performance and high trust more than high performance and low trust. Let me say that again. They would rather hire a person who was not competent in their field, but that they could feel like they could trust him, than someone who was the best at shooting a gun, who was the fittest, who was the strongest, but they couldn't trust him. Isn't that interesting? That in the special ops of the Navy, they would choose someone who may not even be fit, but someone who was trustworthy over somebody who was the greatest man on paper, physically, but they couldn't trust him. Now let's look at the church. The church is exactly the same. Let me ask you something. The person to the left and the right of you, who would you rather? Somebody who can preach well, teach well, clean well, do lots of things well, but you couldn't trust them? Or someone who couldn't do anything? You know, one of those people who just sit around and talk to people, they don't do anything, right? But you can trust them. What type of person would you rather have next to you in church? Of course, trust, right? It's great to have a church who can perform well, who has talents and skills, who can sing, who can play, who can cook, who can clean, who can do everything. But that church doesn't mean much at all if there's no trust together. Now think about this. As a church, what do we place more importance in? Performance or trust? What's actually more desired? Performance. I mean, here's a question for you. If you were, let's say, I want to take Pastor Dan away, he's a hopeless preacher, I don't want him to be at this church anymore, and you guys sat down and you thought, what type of pastor do I want to come in as a replacement for me? Would you rather have a pastor who was good at everything, but you just couldn't trust him? Or would you rather have someone who was very trustworthy, you knew had the best heart for you, but couldn't preach that well, couldn't really do Bible studies that good, he was competent, he was okay? Which pastor would you rather have out of the two? More important. And the only way to actually reach that is to have small groups. You can't build a bond and a trust with someone next to you if you're just sitting down with them in the pews for an hour, listening to someone like me and going home. You need to form a bond with them. We're almost at the end of the message, but I just want to share with you two stories. Anyone know what these devices are? Yeah, Tim, you know. Now, a lot of people who've kind of seen me, and you know Yoshi as well, we used to have this kind of healthy banter between what device was better, Apple or Android or Microsoft, whatever it was, you know, and we all know that Apple's better. But when we talked about this, right, a lot of people thought that I was always the Apple guy. But in actual fact, I was not always the Apple guy. If you go all the way back to 2008, I want to see if anyone knows what this phone is. Anyone have this phone? Yes. Okay. This was the greatest phone ever invented. All right, even more than the latest iPhone. It was so amazing. Now, if you remember what it was called the Samsung Ultra Touch. Remember? Now, it just came out of high school, and I was looking for a job, and I got a job at a phone store called All Phones. I think I've told this before, but I had this phone. And it was such an amazing phone. It had the touch screen, and when you answered the phone, you did the cool slide, and then you call, and then when you finish with them, you go, and it was really cool, right? You don't even do that anymore. And I worked at All Phones, and I made this really strong bond with one of my salespeople. We're actually still friends today. And he was an Apple guy. Now, I hated Apple people. I absolutely hated them. They were so pretentious. They were always telling me how much better their products were. And I'd always say, but I got a better RAM, I got better camera, I got better specs. What have you got? Oh, I just got an Apple, it's better. And you just go, okay, you can't really argue with these guys, right? But I started having a bond with this guy, and I was trying to look at what my next phone would be. And working at All Phones, one of the perks was that I could get a free phone on a plan for 2 years. Great. So I thought, okay, I know which my next phone is. It's going to be the upgraded version of the Ultra Touch. Easy, done deal. I did my research. I checked the specs. There's a website called GSM Arena, which was back, really big back then. But you basically go and you see which one's the best. And Samsung was killing it back then. Anyway, I go to work, and I'm about to get this phone. And my mate and I started talking. And I said, hey, I'm going to grab the new phone. What do you reckon? He goes, why? I said, because it's the best phone on the market. And he goes, I don't care. Apple's better. And he left it at that. We didn't talk about the phone at all. And I thought to myself, I know Apple's not better. I understand that the product, kind of mesmerizes people. And typically, I would just kind of push his advice aside. It wasn't really advice, it was more of a dig. But because I had started to become very good friends with this person, and I actually started to trust his insights because he was quite a smart guy. I thought to myself, maybe I've missed something here. Maybe Apple is better. But I just couldn't see why. Anyway, I kept my Ultra Touch phone for a few more months because I still wanted to make sure I got the right phone. And one day I went to Allphones to grab my new phone, and lo and behold, I chose the iPhone 3GS. And my mate looked at me and he's like, oh yeah, welcome to the club, right? But he asked me and he said, why did you choose the iPhone over the Samsung? And I said, I trust your judgment. And like, I wasn't dumb. I knew the specs. I knew that that phone was better. But for some reason or other, the trust that I had in my friend overrode what I thought was right. And it's because him, now that I'm an Apple guy, I'm so sorry, but it's kind of just, evolved from there. But it all started from someone I trusted who gave me advice that I listened to and I thought was better than what I thought was the right thing. Now, hold that story for a second, that's story one, because I want to talk about the benefits of small groups and trust. Number one, hold that story in your head. Here's the second one. Have you ever seen the TV show Deadliest Catch? Yeah? It was really big about maybe 15, 20 years ago. I think 2005, 2006, around that time. Anyway, I think you can watch it on Binge. Anyway, what they classed this TV show was all about was it was one of the deadliest jobs on earth. And basically the job was that you were crab fishermen and you would go out and you'd fish for crabs. Now you would think, why on earth is that dangerous? Well, they were fishing on the coast of Alaska, which was crazy. In fact, you can probably see some of the waves just on those pictures as to why it was a scary, dangerous job. Now, this is my worst nightmare because I hate drowning. Drowning's my fear. And also being in the middle of nowhere is my fear. And so this would be the worst thing that I could possibly think of to do as a job. And I don't know about you, but not many people would do this. The TV show was basically putting cameras on a few of these boats, not all of them, but just a few of them, and they would follow them on their pursuits of crab fishing. And you would think, how boring. But no, this is a very entertaining show. And there's one episode where they're doing their typical thing. The fishermen are trying to sabotage each other because they want to get to the crabs, and so it's actually quite interesting. There's a lot of drama involved where one person will probably try and take them somewhere else and trick them into going somewhere. It's all this drama, right? But one episode, there was this huge storm, a really big storm, waves going over boats, and you can see how small the boats are. And so you see in this episode the camera on the boat that starts to bring in the pots. They're called pots, they're not nets, that they would catch the crabs in. And they were starting to put the pots in so they could go off to shore to make sure that they were okay. Anyway, the camera spots another boat on the other side, and this boat doesn't have a camera. This is just one of the other boats. But you see, right at the end, that there's a fisherman on the side of the boat trying to get this last pot in. And then suddenly, a huge wave comes to the side of the boat and boom, the boat gets smashed and the fisherman disappears. Now you just go, whoa. Like this is, because you know this is real life. This is not staged like a lot of these TV shows we watch now. This is literally a camera set on a boat and something like this happens. Now, if you know anything about the Alaskan water, it is very cold. And apparently, if you stay in that water for more than 2 minutes, you'll die of hypothermia. So it's very, very serious that this fisherman has dropped into the water. Immediately you see this boat that has the camera on it switch and look towards the boat, and you hear the captain saying, move towards the boat, we need to find the man. And the boat starts to go towards and looks for where the man fell into the water. And it's really crazy stuff. Anyway, they hear this faint call from the water and it says, don't let me die. Don't let me die. And they pull him out after about a minute and they place him on the boat and they take the clothes off because that's what you need to do, grabbed all the blankets, put it on him, and a few hours later he warms up and he survives. And you see in this episode the captain from the boat coming down and looking at this guy, this old guy, and embracing him like he was his own son. Now remember that these are fishermen who, before this incident, were trying to sabotage each other because they didn't want these people to encroach on their crabs. And the competition was fierce. But yet, something like this, where the man falls in the water and they suddenly become close friends like that. It was amazing to see these sailors, these fishermen going home. And I can guarantee to you, that day where they saved the competition, the other person from another boat, his life would have been far more rewarding for them than getting the biggest catch of their life. The idea that they would go and drop everything that they've been doing day in, day out and save this other person's life would have been so important to them. And I'm sure that that day would have stuck in their minds more than the biggest catch that they've ever done in their lives. Now, why do I say these two stories? Well, this idea of trust is really important because the first story talks about trust in a group to keep them accountable. The story of me getting the iPhone, my friend, all he had to do was just say, hey, I don't think that's the right thing you should do. Maybe try something different. But he didn't even say it that way. He just said Apple's better. But because of the trust and the bond that I had with him, I listened. And that's the power of trust in a church, is that a lot of the time we need that accountability to make sure that we're on the right track. And if we're just coming to church, for an hour, week in, week out, grabbing the sermon, the pastor cannot give that to you as strong as the person to your left and to your right, with a trust bond, making sure that you're on the right track. And number two, trust in a group of people to be able to say you can trust them with your lives is one of the best experiences that you can have. Having someone to the left and right of you and know that they have your back no matter what. You guys can have conflicts, we can argue in the board meetings, we can argue in the streets, but when push comes to shove, you know that you're both on the same journey and that you can trust each other with your lives. Bonds a church and bonds any group of people. And this is why small groups are so important. Because everything that I've talked about cannot happen from the pulpit. I cannot impart to you trust. I can give you advice, I can tell you stories, I can tell you something from the Bible, but to build trust, you need to work at it. It's not something that you receive, it's something that is earned. And that has to be done with time together. So let me end with this. Why? What is the importance of small groups? Well, just like the early Christians in Acts, just like the Romans, just like all of the very successful groups in the past, we need to find a balance between the large and the small gatherings. We need to find a balance between what we do here at church in these 1 or 2 hours. These are important too. But we also need to work on what we do outside of church. And see, even then, when I said it, outside of church, that's not true, because church still continues when you meet together outside of this building. Wouldn't you want to go through the deadliest position in the world as a Christian with someone to the left and to the right of you that you can trust them? Maybe they don't perform well. Maybe they're not giving as much to the church as you think they should. But what we should be doing as a church community is building that trust and that bond together so that we can really attack the world and know that what we do here in this community can change the world because of what Christ can do with us together. That is my prayer for us. And this is the journey we're going to go on to strengthen the church and its bonds together as we do this together as a Christian journey.